There's a photograph locked away in the Jefferson County archives that no one dares to discuss. It shows 4 children standing before a farmhouse in the dead winter of 1975. Their eyes are vacant, their clothes torn and hanging from skeletal frames, and in the window behind them, barely visible through the frost-covered glass, is a shape that resembles something human, but not quite. The police officers who discovered these children were ordered into silence. 2 resigned within a month. 1 fled across the country and changed his identity. The children were immediately separated, their files sealed by court order, buried in bureaucratic darkness. But 30 years later, when one survivor finally shattered that silence, what emerged made investigators wish they had burned that cursed house to ash the moment they found it. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching. This helps YouTube share stories like this with others who seek the truth hidden in darkness. This is not folklore. This is not a campfire tale meant to thrill and then fade. This is a documented case of what authorities found when they opened the door to the Hargraves farmhouse on January 14, 1975, and why Jefferson County has spent decades trying to erase it from collective memory. What happened in that isolated house, hidden behind walls of pine trees that seem to grow thicker each year, represents something that exists at the terrifying intersection of human cruelty and something that defies rational explanation. The Hargraves family had occupied the same 200 acres of rural Jefferson County land since 1893, 3 generations calling it home. They existed on the margins of society, keeping to themselves with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The farmhouse sat nearly 4 miles from the nearest paved road, concealed behind a dense barrier of pine trees that seemed determined to swallow the property whole. Neighbors who remembered them from the 1950s and 60s called them peculiar but harmless. They attended church sporadically, sold eggs and vegetables at the farmer's market, but maintained strict boundaries. No one was ever invited onto their property. No visitors were permitted. No explanation was given for why their children stopped attending school after 3rd or 4th grade. By 1974, the Hargraves family had faded from public consciousness entirely. On the frigid morning of January 14, 1975, postal worker Eugene Marsh noticed something that turned his blood to ice. The Hargraves mailbox was overflowing with letters and packages, some postmarked weeks earlier, spilling onto the frozen ground. In 17 years of delivering mail, Eugene knew this sign meant only one thing: death or disaster. He sat in his truck for 10 agonizing minutes, wrestling with a primal instinct screaming at him to drive away. But duty won over dread. He drove up that endless gravel driveway parked before the house and knocked. Silence answered. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Then he heard it. A faint scratching sound emanating from somewhere deep inside the house. Rhythmic, desperate, like fingernails clawing against wood. Eugene didn't open that door. He ran to his truck and drove straight to the sheriff's office, reporting that something was terribly wrong at the Hargraves farm. Sheriff Daniel Crowley dispatched deputies Thomas Gill and Robert Henshaw to perform a welfare check. They arrived just after noon to find what appeared to be an abandoned property. Windows were shrouded in thick curtains that hadn't been opened in years. The front porch was rotting, and there was a smell, sweet and rotten simultaneously, like spoiled meat mixed with something chemical they couldn't identify. Deputy Gill announced their presence and knocked. Silence. He knocked again, shouting that they were coming inside. The door was unlocked. It swung open with a grinding creak, releasing a wave of cold air that seemed to emanate from the house's depths. The interior was pitch black. Using flashlights, they navigated the front hallway and froze. The walls were covered in writing. Thousands upon thousands of words scratched, carved, and written in what appeared to be charcoal and dried blood. Bible verses, apologies, confessions. Some writing was so small and frantic it was illegible. Between the words were drawings, crude, disturbing images of figures with elongated limbs and faces that didn't look quite human. Deputy Gill later told a psychologist that the drawings reminded him of what a child might create while trying to sketch a nightmare they couldn't fully remember. They ventured deeper, calling out. The scratching had stopped. The silence was somehow worse. Every room contained the same chaotic writing, the same disturbing drawings. Furniture lay overturned. Plates of long, rotted food sat on tables. In the kitchen, they discovered something that made Deputy Henshaw vomit on the spot. A large metal tub filled with dark, viscous liquid. Floating in it were dozens of dead birds, mostly crows, their wings removed, their eyes gone. Arranged around the tub in a perfect circle were small handprints pressed into the dust, children's handprints. They were about to call for backup when they heard it, a voice, small and barely audible, coming from upstairs. A child's voice singing what sounded like a nursery rhyme, but the words were wrong, twisted, incomprehensible, yet deeply unsettling. Deputy Gill drew his weapon and climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under his weight. At the end of the second-floor hallway was a closed door. The singing came from behind it. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, turned it and pushed. 4 children huddled together in the corner of an almost empty bedroom. 3 girls and 1 boy, so malnourished their ages were difficult to determine, their faces gaunt and pale, their bodies small and fragile. The oldest girl, later identified as 14-year-old Sarah Hargraves, held the youngest child in her arms, rocking back and forth. None of them reacted when the door opened. They just stared at the wall opposite them, where something had been written in large, shaking letters. Deputy Henshaw immediately radioed for an ambulance and child protective services. He approached slowly, speaking softly, telling them they were safe. But when he got close enough, the oldest girl turned her head. Her eyes were empty, completely devoid of emotion. In a voice that sounded decades older than her years, she said something that made both deputies freeze. "You shouldn't have opened the door. Now he knows you're here." The children were removed within the hour. Paramedics described their condition as severe neglect, bordering on torture. They were dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in bruises and scars, both recent and years old. The youngest, 7-year-old Michael, had never been registered with any school or government agency. Officially, he didn't exist. None of the children spoke during transport. They didn't cry or ask questions. They sat in silence, occasionally whispering to each other in sounds that didn't resemble English. The search for Martin and Constance Hargraves began immediately. Every room, closet, crawl space, and corner of the property was examined. The parents were nowhere to be found. But what investigators discovered was evidence of something far more disturbing than simple neglect. In the basement, accessible only through a trapdoor, hidden beneath a kitchen rug, they found a room converted into something between a chapel and a prison cell. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was stained with substances later confirmed to be blood, both animal and human. In the center stood a wooden chair with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. Scratch marks covered every surface within reach of that chair. Hanging on the wall, directly facing whoever would sit there, was a massive portrait painted in dark, thick oils. It depicted a figure that investigators struggled to describe in official reports. Most said it looked like a man, but the proportions were wrong, limbs too long, the face too smooth, with eyes that seemed to follow you regardless of where you stood. Beneath the portrait was a small altar covered in melted candle wax, dead flowers, and a leather-bound journal belonging to Martin Hargraves. The journal entries began in 1968 and continued until days before the children were found. Early entries were normal, farming, weather, family matters. But by 1970, the tone shifted dramatically. Martin wrote about visions, about a presence watching the family at night. He described voices telling him his children were impure, that they needed cleansing through suffering and isolation. He wrote that Constance saw it too, the figure in their dreams. They called it the shepherd. They believed it had chosen their family for a divine purpose, that by keeping their children isolated and subjecting them to what Martin called spiritual correction, they were saving their souls. The final entry was dated January 10th, 1975, 4 days before the children were found. It consisted of one sentence in handwriting so shaky it was almost illegible. "The shepherd has asked for us, and we must go to him now." The bodies of Martin and Constance Hargraves were discovered 3 days later, nearly 2 miles from the farmhouse, deep in the surrounding woods. A search team with tracking dogs found them. What made the discovery so profoundly unsettling wasn't just that they were dead. It was how they died and the state in which they were found. Both bodies hung from separate trees, roughly 50 feet apart. They had been dead for several days, likely since around the time of that final journal entry. But nothing made sense. There were no ladders nearby, no stumps or rocks they could have stood on. The branches they hung from were at least 10 feet off the ground. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. Their hands were positioned at their sides. Almost peacefully, the medical examiner stated in his report that he could find no logical explanation for how 2 people could have hanged themselves from branches that high, without any means of reaching them. But there was something else, something kept out of official reports and only whispered about among investigators. Both bodies had been mutilated post-mortem. Their eyes had been removed with surgical precision. Carved into their foreheads were symbols matching some of the drawings found in the farmhouse, markings a religious studies professor later identified as a bastardized combination of occult and Christian iconography. Someone or something had performed a ritual on these bodies after death. The investigation was quietly shut down within 6 weeks. The official cause of death: joint suicide brought on by shared psychotic disorder. The house was seized by the county. There was talk of demolishing it, but legal complications prevented this. Instead, it sat empty and decaying for years. Locals avoided it. Stories spread, and the 4 Hargraves children disappeared into the foster care system. Their identities protected, their records sealed by court order. For nearly 3 decades, the Hargraves family existed only as a dark footnote in Jefferson County history. The investigators moved on with their lives, though several admitted years later they never truly moved on at all. The children, scattered across different states with different names, tried to build lives from the ruins of their childhood. But in 2004, everything changed. Sarah Hargraves, the oldest of the 4 children, broke her silence. She was 43, living under a different name in Oregon, working as a librarian, outwardly living a normal life. But she had never escaped that house. The memories followed her everywhere. The nightmares never stopped. After years of therapy and countless failed attempts to move forward, she decided to tell the world what really happened. Sarah explained that the abuse started gradually when she was around 8 years old in 1969. Her father became obsessed with religious texts, not the Bible, but books with strange symbols and writings in languages she didn't recognize. He began conducting ceremonies in the basement, forcing the children to participate, telling them they had been chosen for something important. The punishment started small, hours kneeling in prayer, days without food for perceived sins, but escalated quickly. Her father built the chair in the basement and would force them to sit in it while he read from his books and performed what he called purification rituals. Sometimes these sessions lasted hours, sometimes days. Her mother watched, occasionally participating, convinced they were doing God's work. But here's what sent chills through everyone who heard Sarah's testimony. She insisted her parents weren't entirely wrong about something being in that house. She described a presence that she and her siblings all felt, especially at night. She said there were times when she would wake to see a figure standing in the corner of their room, tall and impossibly thin, watching them with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Her siblings saw it too. All of them did. While her father claimed he was communicating with this entity, Sarah believed that whatever it was had been feeding on their suffering, growing stronger with each act of cruelty inflicted in that house. The other 3 Hargraves children were eventually located by journalists. 2 refused to speak publicly, but the third, Rebecca, who had been 12 when they were rescued, confirmed every detail of Sarah's account. She added that in the final months before rescue, their parents had become completely consumed by their belief in the shepherd. They barely ate or slept, spending almost all their time in the basement preparing for what they called the final offering. Rebecca believed that offering was supposed to be the children, that their parents had been planning to kill them as a sacrifice. If that postal worker hadn't noticed the overflowing mailbox, If those deputies had arrived even a week later, she was certain none of them would have survived. The public response to Sarah's revelations was immediate and intense. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Mental health professionals analyzed it as an extreme example of folie à famille, shared psychotic disorder affecting entire family units. Religious scholars debated whether Martin Hargraves had been influenced by legitimate occult texts or had created his own delusional theology. For the people of Jefferson County, the story brought back memories they had tried to bury for 3 decades. Former Deputy Thomas Gill, now retired and living in Florida, agreed to speak about the case for the first time in 2005. He described returning to the Hargraves farmhouse repeatedly in his dreams, always finding himself back in that basement, staring at that portrait. He admitted requesting a transfer to a different county within months of finding the children because he couldn't drive past that property without feeling overwhelming dread. He said something else too, something that never made it into any official report. On the day they found the children, after they'd been taken to the hospital, he and Deputy Henshaw returned to secure the scene. They went back to the basement. The portrait was different. He swore the figure in the painting had changed position, that it was no longer facing forward but turned slightly, as if looking toward the stairs. Henshaw saw it too. They never mentioned it to anyone because they knew how it would sound. The farmhouse itself became the subject of intense interest. Paranormal investigators requested access. True crime enthusiasts tried to locate the property. But in 2006, after years of legal wrangling, the county finally took action. The house was demolished. Every board, every brick, every piece of that structure was removed and incinerated. The land was sold to a development company planning to build new homes, but construction never began. Workers reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. The project was abandoned. The land sits empty to this day, marked only by a small historical marker that makes no mention of what happened there. It simply states that the property was once home to a family farm established in 1893. The 4 Hargraves children have all requested privacy in the years since their story became public. Sarah passed away in 2019 from cancer. Before her death, she gave one final interview and was asked if she believed her parents were evil or simply mentally ill. Her answer was chilling. Evil and illness aren't always separate things. Sometimes evil finds people who are vulnerable and broken, and it uses them. I forgave my parents years ago because holding on to that anger was just another way that house could keep me trapped. But I will never forgive whatever it was in that basement, watching us, feeding on our pain. I still feel it sometimes, even now, thousands of miles away and decades later. A presence at the edge of my awareness. Waiting, watching, patient. The case of the Hargraves family remains one of the most disturbing examples of familial abuse and shared delusion in American history. But for those who lived through it, for those who saw what was in that house, it represents something darker, a reminder that there are places where human cruelty and the unexplainable intersect, where the line between psychological horror and something genuinely otherworldly becomes impossible to define. The children were found in 1975. They were rescued. They survived. But what they brought with them from that farmhouse, the memories, the scars, the presence that still haunts them, suggests that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The Hargraves family is gone. The house is gone. But on certain nights, people who live near that empty plot of land still report seeing lights moving through the trees where the farmhouse once stood. They report hearing voices, children's voices, singing something that sounds like a lullaby, but with words that make no sense. Words that sound like they're calling something. If you've watched until the end, you're braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? What do you think really happened in that house? Share your thoughts, and remember, some stories are meant to be told, so they're never forgotten. Stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself driving past an abandoned farmhouse hidden behind too many trees with an overflowing mailbox and silence that feels too heavy, just keep driving until next time.